Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, no matter how deep we dig the grave. For 63-year-old Sheriff Amos Callahan, that truth would come clawing its way back to the surface on a dusty afternoon in Silver Hollow. His old Stallion Dustfire had been acting strange for weeks, circling the same patch of earth behind the corral like a dog with a buried bone. Most folks would have dismissed it as stubborn horse behavior, but Amos had learned to trust his stallion's instincts over the years. When he finally grabbed a shovel and started digging, what he found would shake him to his very core. A rusted iron ring, a hidden cellar, and inside, skeletal remains that belonged to Sarah Mackenzie, the woman who vanished 20 years ago. The woman whose disappearance had haunted this town ever since. But what chilled Amos to the bone weren't just the remains. It was the stack of letters found beside them, each one bearing his own name in faded ink. What terrible secret had Sheriff Callahan buried all those years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Hollow, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. Sheriff Amos Callahan stood on the porch of his office, a tin badge catching the early light on his chest, a badge he'd worn for 31 years, through drought and flood, through births and burials, through secrets that would break lesser men. At 63, Amos carried himself with the measured gait of a man who'd learned that most problems could wait until tomorrow, but some demanded immediate attention. His steel-grey hair was still thick beneath his well-worn hat, and his weathered hands showed the calluses of a man who'd never been afraid of honest work. The lines around his blue eyes spoke of squinting into too many sunsets, searching horizons for trouble that might never come, or trouble that had already arrived. Silver Hollow stretched before him like a painting from another time. Population 847 on a good day, fewer when the winter winds drove folks to warmer places. The general store, the barber shop, Doc Henley's medical practice, and Murphy's Tavern formed the heart of a community where everybody knew everybody else's business or thought they did. Behind the main buildings, modest homes with whitewashed fences and kitchen gardens spread out toward the rolling hills that cradled the town like protective arms. This was Amos's domain, his responsibility, his burden. He'd kept the peace here since before most folks could remember, settling disputes with a combination of common sense and quiet authority that had earned him 3 decades of respect. Children waved at him from schoolyard swings, their parents nodded with genuine warmth, and even the troublemakers seemed to straighten up when Sheriff Callahan walked by. But respect was a fragile thing, built over years and easily shattered in moments. Deputy Rosa Martinez emerged from the office, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her uniform pressed crisp despite the early hour. At 32, she'd been Amos's second-in-command for 6 years, long enough to read his moods and respect his methods. She was the daughter he'd never had, the future of law enforcement in Silver Hollow when his time came to hang up the badge. "Morning reports are on your desk," she said, settling beside him on the porch steps. "Old Mrs. Peterson's convinced someone's stealing her newspapers again." "Same someone who's been stealing them for 15 years?" Amos asked with a slight smile. "The very same mysterious newspaper thief who turns out to be a raccoon every time we investigate." Rosa's eyes crinkled with shared amusement, though this time she swears she saw boot prints. Amos nodded, filing the information away. In a town like Silver Hollow, even raccoon disputes mattered. Every small concern addressed helped maintain the delicate balance that kept folks feeling safe in their beds at night. It was the accumulation of small kindnesses and careful attention that had built his reputation, brick by brick, year by year. Doc Henley's ancient pickup truck rattled past, trailing dust and the sound of a muffler that had given up hope years ago. Behind the wheel, Thomas Henley raised a weathered hand in greeting a gesture. Amos returned automatically, though something in the old doctor's expression seemed strained this morning. At 74, Doc had delivered half the babies in Silver Hollow and seen most of their grandparents into the ground. If anyone understood the weight of keeping secrets, it was him. Mayor Patricia Walsh strode across the street with her characteristic brisk efficiency, her heels clicking against the wooden sidewalk. A woman in her late 50s who'd moved to Silver Hollow from the city 15 years ago. She brought organizational skills and political connections that had helped secure funding for road improvements and a new school roof. But she'd never quite lost the air of someone who considered small-town life a temporary assignment rather than a calling. "Sheriff," she called, waving a manila folder. "I need to discuss the budget proposal for next quarter, particularly the overtime allocations." Amos touched the brim of his hat. "I'll stop by after lunch, Mayor. Got some morning rounds to finish first." Patricia's smile was professional but impatient. She'd grown accustomed to getting her way quickly in city government, and the slower pace of rural decision-making sometimes tested her patience. "Of course, but let's not put it off too long. The county commissioners want our numbers by Friday." As she continued down the street, Rosa shook her head slightly. "Still thinks we operate on city schedules out here." "She means well," Amos said, though privately he sometimes wondered if Patricia Walsh's vision for Silver Hollow included room for the kind of quiet community policing that had served them so well. Progress wasn't always improvement, especially when it came at the cost of the personal connections that held small towns together. The bell above Murphy's tavern door chimed as old Pete Kowalski emerged, moving with the careful steps of a man nursing yesterday's poor decisions. Pete had been Silver Hollow's unofficial town drunk for 20 years, harmless but persistent, a walking reminder of how easily a man could lose his way. Amos had driven him home more times than either of them could count, and Pete had never once failed to thank him with genuine gratitude. "Morning, Sheriff," Pete called, squinting against the bright sunlight. "Beautiful day for reflecting on one's choices." "Every day's good for that, Pete," Amos replied. "You need a ride home?" "Nah, I'm walking the straight and narrow today. Literally." Pete gestured toward the sidewalk with mock solemnity. "Doc says my liver needs the exercise more than my drinking arm does." Rosa suppressed a laugh as Pete continued his careful navigation toward home. It was moments like these that reminded Amos why he'd chosen to spend his life in Silver Hollow rather than accepting offers from larger departments over the years. Here, he wasn't just enforcing laws, he was tending to a community, nurturing relationships, keeping watch over people who'd become family over the decades. But family relationships were complicated things, full of love and loyalty, secrets and shame. And Amos Callahan carried more secrets than most people suspected. The memory hit him without warning, as they often did, Sarah Mackenzie's laugh echoing across Murphy's back room during one of the town's rare celebrations. Her auburn hair catching lamplight, her green eyes bright with mischief and something deeper, something that had made his heart skip beats he was too old and too careful to be skipping. She'd been 28 to his 43, too young and too beautiful for a small-town sheriff with more yesterdays than tomorrows. But she'd seen something in him worth pursuing, and for 6 months 20 years ago, Amos had allowed himself to believe in second chances. Until she'd disappeared without a trace, leaving behind questions that had never been answered and a hole in his chest that had never quite healed. "You okay, Sheriff?" Rosa's voice brought him back to the present. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Amos straightened, adjusting his hat to shade his expression. "Just thinking about all the things that need doing today. Come on, let's make those rounds." They walked together down Main Street, Amos greeting each person they passed with the easy familiarity of shared history. Mrs. Chen outside the bakery, flour dusting her apron as she arranged fresh loaves in the window display. Young Jimmy Walsh, the mayor's nephew, practicing basketball shots behind his uncle's garage, each miss followed by muttered determination to do better. Sarah Martinez, Rosa's younger sister, hanging laundry that snapped and danced in the morning breeze like white flags of domestic peace. This was his world, his responsibility, his calling. These people depended on him to keep them safe, to solve their problems, to stand between them and whatever darkness might threaten their quiet lives. They trusted him with their secrets, their fears, their faith in tomorrow. The weight of that trust had never felt heavier than it did this morning, as Dustfire's strange behavior nagged at the edge of his consciousness like a persistent ache. Horses were honest creatures, incapable of deception or hidden agendas. When they acted strange, there was always a reason. And Amos had learned, over 31 years of wearing the badge, that when honest creatures tried to tell you something, the wise man listened. The shovel struck something metallic 3 feet down, sending a jarring vibration up Amos's arms that seemed to echo in his bones. He'd been digging for 20 minutes, following Dustfire's insistent circling, and sweat had soaked through his shirt despite the cool evening air. The Stallion stood nearby, no longer pacing, his dark eyes fixed on the growing hole with an intensity that made Amos's skin crawl. Scraping away the last inches of packed earth, Amos exposed a rusted iron ring, its surface pitted with decades of corrosion. The metal felt cold against his palm as he grasped it and pulled, expecting resistance. Instead, a wooden trapdoor lifted easily, as if someone had maintained the hinges despite the rust on its surface hardware. The smell hit him first, musty earth and something else, something organic and wrong that made his stomach lurch. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing crude wooden steps descending into a cellar that shouldn't exist. This land had been in the Callahan family for 4 generations, and no one had ever mentioned underground chambers. Amos descended carefully, each step creaking under his weight. The cellar was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 8 feet square, with walls of fitted stone that spoke of careful construction. Someone had taken time to build this properly, to make it last. Mason jars lined makeshift shelves along one wall, their contents long since spoiled. A few pieces of rotting furniture suggested this had once been a storage space, maybe a root cellar from the early days of the homestead. But it was the far corner that stopped his heart. Skeletal remains lay arranged on what had once been a blanket, now mostly decomposed threads clinging to yellowed bones. The skull faced the entrance, as if whoever had been placed here was still waiting for someone to return. Scraps of faded fabric suggested a dress, and the delicate bone structure indicated a woman. Beside the remains, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them against time and moisture, lay a stack of letters tied with a ribbon that had once been blue. With trembling hands, Amos lifted the bundle and carefully untied the ribbon. The paper was yellowed but readable, and the first envelope bore his name in handwriting he recognized with a shock that nearly dropped him to his knees. Sarah Mackenzie's careful script, the same handwriting that had once left him love notes tucked under his office door. The first letter was dated 3 days before Sarah's disappearance. Amos's hands shook as he unfolded the paper, his flashlight beam wavering across words that reached out from 20 years in the past like ghostly fingers. My dearest Amos, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. I never wanted to involve you in what I've discovered, but I need someone to know the truth in case something happens to me. The people I trusted, the life I thought I understood, none of it is what it seemed. I came to Silver Hollow for reasons I couldn't tell you, reasons that have nothing to do with the story everyone believes about my past. My real name is not even Sarah Mackenzie, though I've grown to love the woman I became when I took that identity. I've grown to love this town, these people, and most of all, I've grown to love you in ways that complicate everything I was sent here to do. Amos sank to his knees beside the skeletal remains, the letter clutched in hands that seemed to belong to someone else. Sarah had lied to him. Everything he'd believed about their relationship, about her reasons for coming to Silver Hollow, about her feelings for him, all of it built on deception. But as he read further, the betrayal gave way to something far worse: understanding. I was FBI agent Sarah Chen, assigned to investigate corruption and money laundering operations that we believe center on Silver Hollow. What started as a routine investigation into suspicious bank transfers has uncovered something much larger and more dangerous. People you trust, people we both care about, are involved in activities that have brought violence and death to this community. The pregnancy I told you about is real, Amos, but it's not what you think. I've never been pregnant. It was part of my cover story, a way to explain why I might need to leave town suddenly if my investigation was compromised. I've hated lying to you about this more than anything else, because I see how it hurts you to think I'm carrying your child and planning to leave. But now I understand I may actually need to disappear, and not by choice. I've learned too much about the wrong people, and I believe they suspect who I really am. The letter went on to detail bank records, shipping manifests, and meeting locations that painted a picture of Silver Hollow as a way station for illegal activities stretching back years. Names appeared that made Amos's blood run cold: respected citizens, town leaders, people he'd shared coffee with and trusted with his life. The final letter was dated the day Sarah disappeared. Amos, tonight I meet with my contact to arrange extraction. I have enough evidence to bring federal charges, but I also have proof that someone in law enforcement is involved. I can't risk contacting the wrong person, which is why I haven't told you any of this directly. I want you to know that what grew between us was real, even if it started as an assignment. I fell in love with Sheriff Amos Callahan, not because the job required it, but because you're a good man in a world that seems increasingly short of them. When this is over, when the arrests are made and the trials concluded, I hope I can return as Sarah, not Mackenzie, not Chen, just Sarah, and see if what we had can survive the truth. If something happens to me, look for the evidence I've hidden. Trust Deputy Martinez. I've watched her work, and she has the integrity this investigation will need. Trust Doc Henley. He suspected something was wrong and tried to warn me, though he doesn't know specifics. Don't trust Mayor Walsh. Don't trust Thomas Mackenzie at the bank. And Amos, I'm sorry, but don't trust Sheriff Jake Morrison from the county office. The corruption reaches further than Silver Hollow. I love you. I hope that's enough. Sarah. Amos sat in the darkness for a long time, the letters scattered around him like fallen leaves from a poisoned tree. 20 years of guilt, 20 years of wondering what he could have done differently, 20 years of carrying the weight of Sarah's disappearance, all of it based on lies that were actually truths too dangerous to speak. She'd been trying to protect him by keeping secrets. She'd been killed not for love or jealousy or any of the motives that had haunted his dreams, but for doing her job too well. And whoever killed her had been living in Silver Hollow all this time, walking the same streets, sharing the same air, possibly even offering condolences on her disappearance while knowing exactly where she lay buried. A tarnished silver locket caught his flashlight beam, half hidden beneath the remains. Amos lifted it carefully, opening the delicate clasp with fingers that seemed too large and clumsy for such precise work. Inside was a photograph not of him, as he'd half expected and half dreaded, but of a young Asian woman with Sarah's eyes and smile, standing beside an elderly couple in front of what looked like a small restaurant. Her real family, her real life. Sarah Chen, FBI agent, daughter, probably sister and friend to people who'd never learned what happened to her. The weight of it settled on him like a stone, not just her death, but the knowledge that somewhere, people who loved her were still waiting for answers that only he could provide. Parents who'd buried an empty coffin or kept an empty bedroom unchanged, friends who wondered if they'd somehow failed her, colleagues who'd mourned a fellow agent lost in the line of duty. Dustfire nickered softly from above, as if sensing his distress. The Stallion had led him here for a reason, had somehow known that the truth lay buried beneath their feet. But knowing the truth and knowing what to do with it were different things entirely. If Sarah was right, if corruption reached into county law enforcement and town leadership, then revealing what he'd found might put Rosa in danger, might destroy innocent lives caught in the crossfire, might bring federal attention that would tear Silver Hollow apart. But doing nothing meant Sarah's killers continued to walk free, continued to profit from whatever schemes had cost her life. It meant the people she died trying to protect remained in danger from threats they didn't even know existed. Amos carefully gathered the letters and placed them back in their protective wrapping. He took photographs of everything with his phone, though the images felt inadequate to capture the magnitude of what he'd discovered. Sarah's remains deserved better than a forgotten grave beneath someone else's property, deserved the dignity of a proper burial and the justice of a full investigation. But they also deserved to be handled carefully by someone who understood that the truth could be as dangerous as lies when released at the wrong time or to the wrong people. As he climbed back out of the cellar, Amos felt the weight of a new burden settling on his shoulders, heavier than the badge he'd worn for 31 years, heavier than the trust of 847 people who depended on him to keep them safe. He was carrying the last wish of a dead federal agent, the hope of a family that would never stop grieving, and the responsibility of bringing justice to a town that might not survive, learning how deeply corruption had taken root in its foundations. But Sarah Chen had trusted him enough to leave behind a trail that led to this moment. The least he could do was prove worthy of that trust, even if it cost him everything he'd spent 3 decades building. Amos spent the next 3 days carrying Sarah's letters in his jacket pocket, like a man nursing a heart attack, the truth burning against his chest, too dangerous to share and too important to ignore. He moved through his daily routines with mechanical precision, responding to Mrs. Peterson's raccoon complaints and mediating fence-line disputes between neighbors, but his mind remained fixed on those handwritten pages that had rewritten 20 years of his life. The love letters, that's what he'd started thinking of them as. Despite their darker contents, revealed layers of deception and truth so intertwined that separating them felt like trying to unravel a rope while hanging from it. Sarah had loved him, but she'd also been using him. She'd been protecting him by lying, but also endangering him by staying. Every tender moment they'd shared now carried the weight of her hidden mission, every kiss shadowed by the knowledge that she'd been trained to manipulate emotions for the greater good. But the greater good had gotten her killed, and 20 years later, her killers were still walking free. On Thursday morning, Amos unlocked his office before dawn and spread Sarah's case file across his desk, the official one from 1004, thin as tissue paper and just as transparent. Missing person report, filed by her landlady, Mrs. Cordova, who'd grown concerned when Sarah hadn't collected her mail for 3 days. Initial investigation conducted by Sheriff Jake Morrison from County, assisted by then-Deputy Amos Callahan. Reading his own reports from 2 decades ago felt like examining evidence from someone else's life. Deputy Callahan had been thorough, but not suspicious, professional, but not probing. He documented Sarah's personal effects, interviewed her few acquaintances, checked bus stations and airports within 100 miles. He'd followed procedure exactly, never pushing beyond the obvious explanations, never questioning why a young woman might disappear from a small town with nothing but the clothes on her back. But Deputy Callahan hadn't known he was investigating the disappearance of someone he loved. He'd been protecting himself from emotions that might compromise his objectivity, maintaining the professional distance that good police work required. Sheriff Callahan, reading those same reports 20 years later, could see every place where personal involvement might have led to different questions, deeper investigation, connections that Deputy Callahan had been too careful to make. The witness interviews were particularly painful to review. Mrs. Cordova describing Sarah as quiet but friendly, kept to herself mostly, seemed like she might be running from something. Jim Bradley at the general store, mentioning that Sarah always paid cash and never bought more than she could carry in one trip. Doc Henley, noting that Sarah had asked unusual questions about local families during her single visit to his office for a minor cut on her hand. All of it suggested someone living temporarily, someone prepared to leave quickly, someone gathering information rather than putting down roots. But 20 years ago, Deputy Callahan had interpreted these behaviors as evidence of a troubled past rather than an active investigation. The financial records Sheriff Morrison had obtained told a similar story of careful impermanence. Sarah's bank account contained exactly $1,700, deposited in cash over 6 months. No checks, no electronic transfers, no paper trail connecting her to any outside institution. Her landlady had been paid 6 months in advance, also in cash. She'd owned a 12-year-old Honda Civic with New Mexico plates, which had disappeared with her. But Agent Sarah Chen would have had FBI resources, federal backup, sophisticated surveillance equipment. Where were the tools of her trade? Where was her real identity, her federal credentials, her contact protocols with headquarters? Amos locked the case file back in his desk and walked to the Silver Hollow Public Library, a granite building that had served the community since 1923, when railroad money still flowed through town like water from a broken dam. Librarian Helen Kowalski, Pete's daughter-in-law, and the closest thing Silver Hollow had to a research specialist, looked up from her catalog system with surprise. "Morning, Sheriff. Don't usually see you before noon on a Thursday." "Research project," Amos said, settling at one of the library's 2 computer terminals. "Need to look up some old newspaper archives." Helen's eyebrows rose slightly, but she respected the unspoken rule that everyone's reading choices deserved privacy. "Internet's working today, which is more than I can say for yesterday. Holler if you need help with the database searches." The Silver Hollow Gazette had been publishing weekly since 1889, with digital archives going back to 1995. Amos started with the week surrounding Sarah's disappearance, reading each edition carefully for details he might have missed or forgotten. The initial story was front-page news, in a town where most front-page stories involved high school football scores and county fair results. "Local woman disappears without trace," ran above a photograph of Sarah that Amos remembered too well, her official ID photo from the DMV, formal and impersonal, nothing like the laughing woman who'd shared coffee with him on quiet Sunday mornings. But reading deeper into the digital archives, searching for patterns and connections, Amos began to notice things that Deputy Callahan had been too close to see. In the 6 months before Sarah's disappearance, the Gazette had run an unusual number of stories about business developments and civic improvements. New investors expressing interest in Silver Hollow's development potential. Construction contracts awarded to out-of-state companies with impressive credentials and vague project descriptions. A proposed rail spur that would connect Silver Hollow more directly to interstate commerce. All of it suggested money flowing into town from sources that hadn't existed before Sarah arrived and dried up shortly after she disappeared. Amos cross-referenced names and dates, building a timeline that painted Silver Hollow not as the sleepy community he'd always known, but as a place briefly touched by outside interest and outside money. Mayor Patricia Walsh had been instrumental in courting these investments, according to the news reports. Thomas Mackenzie at the bank had facilitated loans and property transfers. Even Sheriff Morrison had been quoted expressing support for responsible development that respects our community values while embracing economic opportunity. By noon, Amos had filled 3 pages with notes and connections, but he was no closer to understanding what had brought FBI attention to Silver Hollow or who had killed Sarah Chen to stop her investigation. He was, however, beginning to suspect that the woman he'd known as Sarah Mackenzie had uncovered something significant enough to justify maintaining deep cover for 6 months and significant enough to kill for when discovery became likely. Walking back to his office, Amos noticed Martha Henley tending the flower boxes outside Doc's medical practice. At 72, Martha had lived in Silver Hollow longer than anyone except Pete Kowalski, and her memory for local gossip was encyclopedic. She looked up as Amos approached, her weathered hands still graceful as they arranged late-season chrysanthemums. "Sheriff Callahan," she said with the warm smile that had greeted him for 30 years. "Lovely morning for reflection." "Indeed it is, Mrs. Henley. Those flowers are beautiful as always." Martha's hands paused in their work, and something in her expression grew thoughtful. "You know, I was just thinking about gardens and how things that seem dead sometimes come back to life when conditions are right. Amazing how the earth holds on to things, keeps them safe until the time comes for truth to bloom again." The words were casual, conversational, but Amos felt his pulse quicken. Martha Henley was known for speaking in metaphors, but this felt different, more pointed, more deliberate. "I imagine gardeners see a lot of things over the years," he said carefully. "Changes in the soil, unusual growth patterns, things that don't quite match what was planted." Martha's eyes met his, and he saw something there that might have been relief or recognition or warning. "Oh yes, Sheriff, gardeners see everything eventually. And sometimes we see things we're not supposed to see, things that make us wonder if we should speak up or keep quiet for the sake of everyone's peace of mind." She returned to her flower arrangement, but her voice carried clearly in the still air. "I always told Thomas Doc, that secrets are like weeds. Leave them alone and they spread. Try to pull them up carelessly and you might damage the good plants growing nearby. But sometimes, Sheriff, sometimes the weeds have to be removed, no matter how much disruption it causes the garden." Amos felt the weight of Sarah's letters in his pocket, the burden of knowledge that was changing how he saw everything familiar around him. Martha Henley knew something about Sarah's disappearance, maybe not the full truth, but something significant enough to speak in careful metaphors to the town sheriff after 20 years of silence. "Mrs. Henley," he said quietly, "if a gardener discovered something that needed attention, something that might require help from someone with different expertise, would you encourage them to reach out?" Martha's hands stilled completely, and when she looked at him again, her expression held depths of knowledge and sorrow that took his breath away. "I would tell them," she said slowly, "to be very careful about who they trust. And I would tell them that some plants have roots deeper than anyone expects, and pulling them up might disturb more earth than they're prepared to handle." She paused, glancing toward the bank, where Thomas Mackenzie's office window reflected the midday sun. "But I would also tell them that letting poisonous things grow unchecked eventually kills everything good in the garden." Amos touched the brim of his hat and continued toward his office, but Martha's voice followed him one last time. "Sheriff, that young woman who disappeared all those years ago, Sarah Mackenzie, she used to stop by sometimes, ask me about local families, local history. Said she was interested in understanding the community she'd joined. I always thought she was running from something, but now I wonder if she was running toward something instead." The implication hung in the air between them like morning mist, substantial enough to feel, but too delicate to grasp directly. Martha Henley suspected the truth about Sarah's real purpose in Silver Hollow, had suspected it for 20 years, and was finally ready to share that suspicion with someone who might be able to act on it. But she was also warning him about the dangers of digging too deep, of trusting the wrong people, of underestimating how far corruption might reach. As Amos unlocked his office door, he realized that his investigation into Sarah's murder had already begun to change him. He was no longer the sheriff of a peaceful community with simple problems and straightforward solutions. He was now the custodian of federal evidence, the keeper of dangerous secrets, and potentially the only person standing between Silver Hollow and a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making. The missing person report lay open on Amos's desk like a wound that wouldn't heal, its pages yellowed with age, but still bleeding secrets he was only beginning to understand. Friday morning brought autumn's first real chill, and he'd arrived at the office before sunrise to study the document that had haunted him for 20 years, though now for entirely different reasons. Deputy Rosa Martinez found him there at 7:30, squinting at photocopied witness statements under the harsh fluorescent light that made everything look sickly and insubstantial. She set 2 cups of coffee on his desk and settled into the chair across from him with the easy familiarity of someone who'd learned to read his moods. "You've been acting strange all week," she said without preamble. "Distracted, jumpy, asking odd questions about old cases. Either you're having a midlife crisis 20 years late, or something's eating at you that I need to know about." Amos looked up from the report, studying Rosa's face in the morning light, filtering through the office windows. Sarah's last letter had specifically mentioned trusting Deputy Martinez, had praised her integrity and instincts. But trusting someone with information that could get them killed was different from trusting them with routine police work, and Amos wasn't ready to make that leap. Not yet. "Just reviewing some old files," he said, closing the folder carefully. "Sometimes a fresh look at cold cases turns up things we missed the first time." Rosa's dark eyes remained fixed on his face, reading the lie as clearly as if he'd written it on paper. The Sarah Mackenzie case. It wasn't a question, and Amos felt his carefully maintained composure crack slightly. "What makes you say that?" "Because it's the only case that's ever made you look like you're carrying the weight of the world. And because Mrs. Henley called this morning, said she'd had an interesting conversation with you yesterday about gardens and secrets." Rosa leaned forward, her voice dropping to a tone that brooked no argument. "Sheriff, I've worked with you for 6 years. I know when you're investigating something you can't talk about, and I know when you need backup, whether you admit it or not." The internal debate lasted perhaps 10 seconds, weighing Sarah's warnings about corruption against his growing certainty that Rosa Martinez was exactly who she appeared to be, a good cop with integrity that couldn't be bought or threatened. Sometimes trust was a luxury, sometimes it was a necessity. "If I told you I'd found new evidence in the Mackenzie case," he said slowly, "evidence that suggested her disappearance involved more than anyone realized at the time, would you be willing to help investigate without asking too many questions about how I came by the information?" Rosa's expression grew serious. "Depends on the evidence and what kind of help you need, but generally, yes." Amos pulled out copies he'd made of Sarah's letters, keeping the originals locked in his home safe, and spread them across the desk. "Read these. Take your time. And Rosa, what you're about to learn doesn't leave this room until we figure out what to do with it." She read in silence for 20 minutes, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock to grim understanding. When she finally looked up, her face carried the same weight that had been pressing on Amos's shoulders since Tuesday night. "She was FBI," Rosa said quietly. "She was investigating corruption here in Silver Hollow, and someone killed her for it. That's what the evidence suggests." "And you were—" Rosa hesitated, clearly trying to find a diplomatic way to address the personal dimension of the case. "I was involved with her," Amos said simply. "Thought I loved her, thought she loved me back. Turns out the relationship was more complicated than I understood at the time." Rosa nodded, her expression compassionate but professional. The letters suggest her feelings were real, even if the circumstances weren't what they seemed. "Maybe. Or maybe she was just very good at her job." Amos gathered the letters carefully. "Either way, someone killed a federal agent and buried her in an unmarked grave. That's murder, and it's been unsolved for 20 years. What's our next step?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. Rosa was committing herself to an investigation that could destroy careers, relationships, maybe lives. She was trusting Amos's judgment about evidence that implicated respected members of their community. She was choosing justice over safety, truth over comfort. "We need to understand what Sarah was really investigating," Amos said. "The letters mention bank records, shipping manifests, meeting locations. We need to figure out what illegal activity was significant enough to bring federal attention to Silver Hollow." They spent the morning researching property transfers and business licenses from the period around Sarah's disappearance, building a timeline of economic activity that painted Silver Hollow as busier than anyone remembered. Rosa proved surprisingly adept at following paper trails, her accounting background helping her spot irregularities that Amos would have missed. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of property transactions from late 2003. Three different out-of-state companies bought land around Silver Hollow within 2 months of each other. Agricultural land, mostly, but also some mineral rights and water access. Then all three companies were dissolved within 6 months of Sarah's disappearance. Amos studied the documents, noting names and dates. Shell companies. Someone was buying up land through intermediaries, probably planning some kind of development project, or using the land for something that required privacy and isolation, Rosa said grimly. The mineral rights purchases are particularly interesting. Why would agricultural investors need subsurface rights unless they were planning to dig? The implication hung between them like a storm cloud. Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, money laundering, all of them required secure locations where shipments could be received, processed, and redistributed without attracting attention. Silver Hollow's location, along old railroad routes and county roads, made it an ideal way station for illegal activities. At noon, they drove to the bank, where Thomas Mackenzie served as president, a position he'd held since his father's retirement 15 years earlier. The Mackenzie family had been pillars of Silver Hollow for 3 generations, respected for their financial stewardship and community involvement. Thomas was 55, married to his high school sweetheart, father of 2 successful children who'd moved to larger cities but returned for holidays and family celebrations. He was also Sarah Mackenzie's supposed brother, the man who'd filed the missing person report and handled her few financial affairs after her disappearance. Thomas greeted them with the warm professionalism he'd perfected over decades of small-town banking, his office decorated with photographs of community events and family milestones that testified to a life lived in service to others. But Amos noticed something new in the man's eyes, a wariness that hadn't been there a week ago, a caution that suggested awareness of changing circumstances. "Sheriff, Deputy Martinez," Thomas said, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs arranged around his desk. "What can I do for you today?" "We're reviewing some old cases," Amos said carefully, "including your sister's disappearance. I know it's been 20 years, but sometimes fresh eyes spot things that were overlooked initially." Thomas's expression grew pained, though whether from genuine grief or carefully practiced performance, Amos couldn't tell. "Of course, Sheriff, anything that might help bring closure to that terrible time." "Tell me about Sarah's background before she came to Silver Hollow," Rosa said, her notebook open and pen ready. "Her education, previous employment, why she decided to move here." The questions were routine, the kind any investigator might ask when reviewing a cold case. But Amos watched Thomas's face carefully, looking for tells that might reveal knowledge he shouldn't possess. "Sarah was always the restless one in our family," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of old sorrow. "Graduated from college in Albuquerque, worked various jobs, never seemed to find her place. She said she wanted to try small-town life, see if she could put down roots somewhere quiet and safe." "What about her personal life? Relationships, friendships, anyone who might have followed her here or wanted to harm her?" Thomas shook his head, but something flickered in his expression too quick to identify, too deliberate to ignore. "Sarah was private about such things. I know she was dating someone here in town, but she never discussed details with family." The lie was smoothly delivered, practiced and polished, but it was still a lie. According to Sarah's letters, Thomas Mackenzie had pressured her to leave town quietly when he discovered her pregnancy, a pregnancy that had been fictional, part of her cover story. Which meant Thomas had known more about Sarah's personal life than he was admitting, had been involved in her decision-making in ways that contradicted his current story. "Bank records from that time show several cash deposits to Sarah's account," Rosa said, consulting her notes. "Large amounts, always in cash, no clear source. Do you remember her mentioning any employment or income streams?" "She worked odd jobs, I think. House cleaning, some bookkeeping for local businesses. Sarah always preferred cash payments, said it helped her manage her budget better. Another lie, or at least a significant omission. FBI agents had steady salaries and federal benefits. They didn't need odd jobs to support themselves. But Agent Sarah Chen might have taken such work as cover for her investigation, accessing businesses and homes that could provide intelligence about illegal activities. They talked for another 20 minutes, Thomas providing reasonable answers to routine questions while carefully avoiding any information that might suggest deeper knowledge of Sarah's true circumstances. Amos left the bank with more questions than answers, but also with growing certainty that Thomas Mackenzie knew far more about his sister's disappearance than he'd ever admitted. Walking back to the office, Rosa spoke quietly about their next steps. "He's lying, but we can't prove it yet. And even if we could, lying about a family member's personal life isn't necessarily criminal. Depends on why he's lying," Amos said. "If he knew Sarah was investigating illegal activities, if he was involved in whatever brought her here, then his lies become obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, maybe conspiracy. We need more evidence, paper trails, witness statements, something concrete that connects him to whatever Sarah was really investigating." They were interrupted by the sight of Mayor Patricia Walsh striding toward them from the direction of the post office, her expression carrying the kind of determined focus that usually meant trouble for everyone in her path. She intercepted them outside Murphy's Tavern, her manila folder clutched like a weapon. "Sheriff, I need to discuss your budget requests immediately. The county commissioners are asking specific questions about your overtime allocations, and I need answers before this afternoon's meeting." Amos studied her face, noting the tension around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that suggested stress beyond routine budget concerns. According to Sarah's letters, Mayor Walsh was someone he shouldn't trust, someone potentially involved in the corruption that had cost Agent Chen her life. "Of course, Mayor. Why don't we schedule a meeting for Monday morning when I can give you my full attention?" Patricia's jaw tightened. "This can't wait until Monday. The commissioners want explanations now, particularly about your recent investigative activities and any unusual expenses related to old cases." The words were carefully chosen, but their implications struck Amos like a physical blow. Someone had been watching his activities, tracking his research, reporting back to people who had reasons to be concerned about renewed interest in 20-year-old mysteries. "I'm not sure what you mean by unusual expenses," he said evenly. "Standard police work doesn't require special budget allocations. Nevertheless, I need detailed accounting of your time and resources for the past week. Written reports, expense justifications, explanations of any evidence collection or storage costs." Patricia's voice carried an edge of authority that suggested consequences for non-compliance. Rosa stepped forward slightly, her hand resting casually near her service weapon, in a gesture that could appear innocent to casual observers, but carried clear meaning for anyone watching carefully. "Mayor, is there some specific concern about the sheriff's work that we should address directly?" The standoff lasted perhaps 10 seconds before Patricia's political instincts reasserted themselves. Her smile returned, professional and cold, but her voice modulated to more reasonable tones. "Of course not, Deputy. I'm simply doing my job, ensuring proper fiscal oversight of municipal resources. Sheriff, I'll expect those reports by close of business today." As she walked away, Amos felt the weight of Sarah's warnings settling more heavily on his shoulders. The investigation was already drawing attention from people who had reasons to keep the past buried. And if Mayor Walsh was involved in whatever had gotten Sarah killed, then time was running out to gather evidence before powerful people moved to protect themselves. The game had begun, whether he was ready or not. Saturday morning found Amos back at the cellar where Sarah's remains lay waiting for justice, this time armed with a more powerful flashlight and a growing sense that the underground chamber held secrets beyond a single grave. Rosa stood beside him at the edge of the hole, her expression grim as she surveyed the scene that had haunted his dreams for 4 nights running. "The construction is too sophisticated for a simple root cellar," she said, studying the fitted stone walls and carefully mortared joints. "Someone invested serious time and effort in building this space to last." Amos nodded, playing his light across the walls more systematically than he'd done during his initial shocked discovery. The stonework was indeed professional quality, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of expertise and planning rather than hasty concealment. But it was the far wall that drew his attention, now an area partially obscured by the makeshift shelving that had once held preserved goods. Moving carefully around Sarah's remains, he examined the wall more closely and found what he'd suspected: a seam in the stonework, barely visible, but suggesting another opening beyond the burial chamber. The shelving unit, when moved aside, revealed a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness beyond his flashlight's range. "There's more," he said quietly. "This cellar connects to something else." Rosa descended the wooden steps carefully, her own flashlight adding to the illumination that made the underground space feel less like a tomb and more like an archaeological discovery. Together, they squeezed through the narrow opening and found themselves in a tunnel that had been carved from the living rock, its walls smooth from decades of use and lined with wooden supports that spoke of Prohibition-era construction. "Bootlegger tunnels," Rosa breathed, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I've heard stories about these, but I always thought they were local folklore." The tunnel stretched in both directions, disappearing beyond their combined lights. Amos chose the path that led away from his property, following a route that seemed to angle toward the center of town. The construction was remarkable for its era: proper drainage, adequate ventilation, even electrical conduits that suggested the tunnels had been maintained and modernized over the decades since Prohibition ended. After 200 yards of careful progress, they emerged into a larger chamber that took Amos's breath away. This was no simple smuggler's cache, but a sophisticated distribution center with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions and evidence of recent use that made his blood run cold. Empty wooden crates lined the walls, their markings indicating contents far removed from bootleg whiskey. Shipping labels in multiple languages, customs stamps that suggested international origins, and serial numbers that spoke of modern logistics rather than 1920s moonshine operations. Someone had been using these tunnels for large-scale smuggling operations, and the evidence suggested activity that had continued into the present day. Rosa found a bootlegger's map tucked into a wooden crate, its hand-drawn lines showing tunnel routes that connected Silver Hollow to locations throughout the county. The map was annotated in multiple hands, with dates and codes that suggested decades of use by different organizations for different purposes. "This explains how Silver Hollow could be a distribution center," she said, studying the intricate network of underground passages. "You could move cargo in and out of town completely invisibly, connect to railroad lines and highways without any surface transportation that might attract attention." Amos traced the tunnel routes with his finger, noting connections to properties throughout Silver Hollow and beyond. The bank, the old railroad depot, Mayor Walsh's property, even connections that led toward the county sheriff's office 20 miles away. What had started as Prohibition-era bootlegging infrastructure had evolved into a sophisticated smuggling network that could handle modern criminal enterprises. But it was the evidence of recent activity that concerned him most. Fresh tire tracks in the tunnel floors where wheeled carts had transported heavy loads. New electrical installations that provided lighting and power for operations. Climate control systems that would protect sensitive cargo from temperature and humidity variations. Someone was still using these tunnels, still operating whatever criminal enterprise had brought FBI agent Sarah Chen to Silver Hollow and cost her life. They followed another branch of the tunnel system that led upward toward what Amos calculated must be the center of town. After a steep climb through increasingly well-maintained passages, they emerged through a concealed entrance into the basement of Mackenzie's bank, the very institution where Thomas Mackenzie had sat across from them 24 hours earlier, lying smoothly about his knowledge of Sarah's activities. "He's been using the bank as a front," Rosa said, examining sophisticated security systems and surveillance equipment that had no legitimate purpose in a small-town financial institution. "Whatever they're smuggling comes through the tunnels and gets processed here before distribution." The basement contained evidence of money laundering operations that dwarfed anything Amos had imagined possible in Silver Hollow. Currency counting machines, document shredders, computers with encrypted hard drives, and safes that were considerably more sophisticated than anything needed for routine banking operations. But it was the shipping manifests they found that revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise Sarah had been investigating. Drugs, yes, but also weapons, stolen art, conflict minerals, and human trafficking documentation that made Amos's stomach turn. Silver Hollow hadn't just been a way station for criminal activity, it had been a major distribution hub for multiple criminal organizations, with tentacles reaching across the country and internationally. And all of it flowing through the respectable facade of a small-town bank run by a man whose family had been trusted community leaders for 3 generations. Rosa photographed everything with her phone, while Amos copied serial numbers and shipping codes that could provide federal investigators with evidence of a criminal conspiracy spanning decades. The scope of what they'd uncovered was overwhelming, too large for a small-town sheriff to handle alone, too dangerous to ignore, too complex to unravel without resources they didn't possess. But they were interrupted by the sound of footsteps in the bank above them, heavy boots moving with purpose across the main floor. Amos checked his watch nearly noon on Saturday, when the bank should be closed and empty. Someone was conducting business that couldn't wait for normal hours, and their presence in the basement during such activities could prove fatal. They moved quickly but quietly toward the tunnel entrance, gathering their evidence and preparing to retreat through the underground passages. But the footsteps above were moving toward the basement stairs, accompanied by voices that carried clearly in the silence of the closed building. "Told you the sheriff's been asking questions about the Mackenzie woman," came a voice Amos recognized as Mayor Walsh's, tight with strain and barely controlled anger. "And I told you I handled it." "Thomas," Mackenzie replied, his tone carrying an edge that was nothing like the gentle banker who'd served them coffee and sympathy. "Callahan doesn't know anything that can hurt us. He knows enough to be digging into old files, asking about property transfers and business licenses. That's more than anyone's asked in 20 years. Thomas, more than we can afford to have anyone asking." The voices were getting closer, descending the stairs toward the basement where Amos and Rosa crouched in darkness beside the tunnel entrance. There was no time for a careful retreat, no opportunity to avoid confrontation if they were discovered. Rosa had her service weapon drawn, her expression grim as she positioned herself to cover their escape route. "We should have handled this problem when it first surfaced," Patricia Walsh continued, her voice now clearly audible as she entered the basement. "Should have made sure Sheriff Callahan understood the consequences of excessive curiosity about matters that don't concern him." "The consequences," Thomas replied, and his voice carried the cold certainty of a man who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, "may still need to be explained, depending on what our investigation reveals about exactly what the good sheriff knows and how he came to know it." Amos felt the weight of Sarah's letters in his jacket pocket, evidence that could destroy the conspiracy, but also evidence that had already marked him for elimination. The conversation above made it clear that Mayor Walsh and Thomas Mackenzie were aware of his investigation, were treating it as a threat serious enough to require permanent solution. But as they huddled in the tunnel entrance, listening to plans for their potential murder being discussed with the casual efficiency of a business meeting, Amos realized something that sent ice through his veins. They weren't the only ones who'd been using the tunnels for clandestine activities. Fresh footprints in the tunnel floor behind them, heading in the direction they'd come from. Someone else had been in the passages recently, someone who'd followed their route and might now be positioned between them and their only known exit. The trap was closing, and Sheriff Amos Callahan was beginning to understand that investigating a 20-year-old murder might cost him and Rosa their lives before they could bring Sarah's killers to justice. The photographs were spread across Amos's kitchen table like evidence from a nightmare, their stark black and white images revealing Silver Hollow's respected citizens in situations that would destroy reputations and end careers. Sunday morning light filtered through his windows, casting harsh shadows across faces he'd known and trusted for decades, now revealed as participants in activities that justified federal investigation and 20 years of carefully maintained silence. Rosa sat across from him, her coffee growing cold, as she studied image after image of meetings that should never have occurred, transactions that violated every law governing legitimate business, and participants who represented the social and political leadership of their community. They'd found the photographs in a waterproof case hidden behind Sarah's remains, her final insurance policy against the people who'd ultimately killed her for knowing too much. "Look at the dates," Rosa said, pointing to timestamp markings that revealed when each image had been captured. These span almost 6 months. Sarah was documenting regular meetings, ongoing criminal activity, systematic corruption involving multiple participants. The images told a story of Silver Hollow as a carefully orchestrated criminal enterprise disguised as a sleepy rural community. Mayor Patricia Walsh meeting with men in expensive suits whose faces suggested connections to organized crime. Thomas Mackenzie counting stacks of cash that dwarfed any legitimate banking transaction. Sheriff Jake Morrison from the county office, accepting envelopes that clearly contained more than routine correspondence. But the most damning photographs showed participants Amos recognized from everyday interactions over the years. Doc Henley's participation explained his wife's cryptic warnings about secrets and gardens he'd been compromised by whatever illegal activities had funded Silver Hollow's recent prosperity. Even Pete Kowalski appeared in several images, his alcoholism apparently a cover for activities that required him to be seen as harmless and overlooked. She was building a federal case, Amos said, studying photographs that documented money laundering, drug distribution, and what appeared to be human trafficking coordination. 6 months of undercover work, systematic evidence gathering, probably planning to bring in FBI teams for coordinated arrests that would have dismantled the entire operation. Rosa nodded grimly, until someone figured out who she really was and eliminated the threat. The blackmail potential of such photographs was enormous enough to explain why Sarah's investigation had ultimately gotten her killed, why her remains had been hidden rather than simply disposed of, why the criminal enterprise had continued operating for 20 years after her murder. Someone had wanted to ensure her evidence remained buried with her, unable to surface and threaten the carefully constructed facade of respectability that allowed Silver Hollow's illegal activities to continue. But now the photographs were above ground, in the hands of law enforcement officers who couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. The question was what to do with evidence that implicated most of Silver Hollow's leadership in federal crimes, while potentially putting innocent citizens at risk from violent criminals who'd already killed to protect their secrets. Amos's phone rang, interrupting their analysis with a sound that seemed obscenely normal, given the gravity of what they'd uncovered. The caller ID showed Mayor Walsh's office number, and something in the timing felt deliberate and ominous. "Sheriff." Patricia's voice carried its usual professional efficiency, but underneath lay something that might have been threat or warning. "I need to see you immediately. There's been a development regarding your budget review that requires immediate attention. I can be there in an hour." "Now, Sheriff, this can't wait for your convenience. My office, immediately, and bring any files or evidence related to recent investigative activities you've been conducting." The line went dead, leaving Amos staring at the phone while Rosa gathered the photographs with efficient urgency. They both understood the implications. Their investigation had been discovered, their activities were being monitored, and Mayor Walsh was demanding immediate surrender of evidence that could destroy her and her co-conspirators. "It's a trap," Rosa said simply. "They know we've found Sarah's evidence, and they're moving to contain the damage." Amos nodded, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead toward confrontation with people who'd already demonstrated willingness to commit murder. But running wasn't an option. Silver Hollow was his responsibility. Its citizens deserved protection from criminals who'd been exploiting them for decades, and Sarah Chen deserved justice even if it cost him his life. "We need backup," he said, reaching for his personal cell phone rather than the police radio that might be monitored by conspirators in county law enforcement. "Federal backup, people who can handle evidence this sensitive and dangerous." But as he started to dial, Rosa's sharp intake of breath made him look toward the window, where vehicles were pulling into his driveway with the coordinated precision of a law enforcement operation. 3 black SUVs, county sheriff's vehicles, and what appeared to be federal agents in unmarked cars, a show of force that suggested the trap was already closing around them. "Back door," Rosa said urgently, gathering the photographs and Sarah's letters into a waterproof bag. "We can reach the tree line before they establish a perimeter." They moved quickly through Amos's house, collecting evidence and preparing for flight from their own colleagues, from people who should have been allies in the pursuit of justice. But as they reached the kitchen door, Amos stopped, his hand on the knob, his conscience warring with his survival instincts. "I can't run, Rosa. This is my town, my responsibility. These are my people, and they deserve better than having their sheriff flee when things get dangerous. They deserve having their sheriff alive to bring justice," she replied firmly. "Dead heroes don't solve crimes or protect communities." The sound of vehicles surrounding the house grew louder, doors slamming, and voices coordinating what appeared to be a tactical approach to apprehension. But mixed with the official voices were others that Amos recognized: Thomas Mackenzie, Mayor Walsh, even Doc Henley, speaking with the authority of people who'd been planning this confrontation. Which meant the approaching law enforcement officers were either compromised or operating on false information provided by conspirators who needed to eliminate witnesses to 20 years of criminal activity. Rosa's phone buzzed with a text message that made her expression go pale. She showed Amos the screen. "Sheriff station surrounded. Your house surrounded. Surrender evidence or civilians start dying. Clock starts now." The message was unsigned, but its implications were clear. Whoever was coordinating the response to their investigation had moved beyond threats and warnings to active hostage-taking, using Silver Hollow's innocent citizens as leverage to force surrender of evidence that could destroy the criminal enterprise. "They're not just trying to silence us," Amos said grimly. "They're threatening the entire town to protect their operation." Through the kitchen window, he could see Mrs. Peterson being escorted from her house by men in tactical gear, her elderly frame shaking with fear as she was loaded into one of the black SUVs. Similar scenes were playing out throughout the neighborhood, citizens being detained under the guise of protective custody, actually serving as human shields to prevent law enforcement response. The conspiracy had revealed its true scope and ruthlessness, demonstrating that it commanded resources and personnel far beyond a small-town criminal enterprise. This was organized crime with federal connections, professional criminals with access to law enforcement equipment and authority, people who could manipulate official channels to eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability. But as Amos watched his neighbors being systematically detained by people claiming to be protecting them, he realized that running was no longer an option, even if his conscience allowed it. The only way to save Silver Hollow from the criminals who'd been exploiting it was to ensure Sarah's evidence reached federal authorities who weren't compromised by the conspiracy. And the only way to do that was to stay alive long enough to deliver testimony that could bring justice to a community that had been betrayed by its own leaders for 2 decades. Rosa was already moving toward the basement, toward the tunnel entrance they'd discovered beneath Amos's property. The same underground network that had allowed them to uncover the conspiracy might now provide their only escape route. But as they descended into the darkness with evidence that could save their town, Amos understood that they were entering a maze controlled by their enemies, pursued by people who knew the tunnels better and had resources they couldn't match. The hunt for Sheriff Amos Callahan and Deputy Rosa Martinez had begun, and the stakes were no longer just justice for Sarah Chen, but survival for everyone who called Silver Hollow home. The false identity papers lay scattered across the tunnel floor where they'd fallen from Sarah's evidence cache, their official seals and federal formatting clearly visible in the harsh LED light of Rosa's tactical flashlight. But it was the photographs clipped to the documents that had frozen Amos in place, his hands trembling as he recognized a face he'd known intimately but had never truly understood. Agent Sarah Chen stared back at him from an FBI identification card, her expression professionally neutral, her real name typed in government fonts that made the deception feel both more and less personal. But these weren't the documents that had shattered his understanding of everything he'd believed for 20 years. Those were the mission briefings, the operational reports, the psychological profiles that revealed the truth about why Sarah Mackenzie had come to Silver Hollow and what her real feelings had been during their 6-month relationship. Target: Sheriff Amos Callahan. Rosa read from the operational directive, her voice hollow in the confined space of the tunnel. Asset is directed to establish intimate relationship with primary target to facilitate intelligence gathering on criminal activities within Silver Hollow jurisdiction. Target is believed to be either complicit in ongoing criminal enterprise or deliberately ignoring evidence thereof. The words hit Amos like physical blows, each sentence reframing memories he'd cherished into evidence of professional manipulation. Every tender moment, every declaration of love, every night they'd spent planning a future together, all of it orchestrated by federal agents who'd suspected him of corruption or criminal negligence. Sarah hadn't fallen in love with a small-town sheriff. She'd been assigned to seduce a potential criminal. "There's more," Rosa said quietly, lifting additional documents that bore more recent dates. Mission updates, revised assessments, recommendations for continued operation. But as she read the later reports aloud, a different picture emerged, one that complicated the narrative of simple deception in ways that made Amos's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. Subject Callahan appears to be genuinely committed to law enforcement principles and community protection, came Sarah's voice from 20 years in the past, preserved in official reports that had never been meant for his eyes. No evidence of corruption or criminal complicity detected, despite extensive observation and testing of subjects' integrity under various scenarios. The reports detailed Sarah's growing respect for Amos's character, her professional assessment that he was neither corrupt nor negligent, but simply operating in a small community where sophisticated criminal activity had been carefully concealed from local law enforcement. More than that, they revealed her growing personal attachment to a man she'd been sent to investigate but had found worthy of genuine affection. Agent Chen requests reassignment to avoid compromise of operational objectivity. Rosa read from a report dated 2 months before Sarah's death. Personal feelings for investigation target, threaten mission effectiveness and professional judgment. Recommend immediate extraction and replacement with agent capable of maintaining necessary emotional distance. But the request had been denied, and the final reports showed why. Sarah had uncovered evidence of criminal activity far more extensive than anyone had suspected, requiring continued deep cover to document the full scope of corruption. Her emotional involvement with Amos had provided perfect camouflage for an investigation that had expanded from suspected local corruption to international criminal conspiracy. "She did fall in love with you," Rosa said softly, studying the increasingly personal tone of Sarah's later reports. "The mission started as deception, but it became real. She was trying to protect both you and the investigation by requesting transfer." Amos sank against the tunnel wall, the weight of 2 decades of guilt and anger shifting into something more complex and painful. Sarah had loved him, but she'd also been trained to manipulate his emotions for federal purposes. She'd been protecting him from a criminal conspiracy he'd never suspected, but she'd also been evaluating his integrity and finding him wanting until proven otherwise. Every moment of their relationship had been both authentic and artificial, real and professional, true and false. The final documents in Sarah's cache revealed the scope of what she'd uncovered and why her superiors had refused her transfer request. Silver Hollow wasn't just a distribution point for drugs and stolen goods. It was a training facility for human trafficking operations, a money laundering center for international organized crime, and a weapons cache that supplied criminal organizations across the Southwest. The respectable citizens of Silver Hollow weren't just participants in local corruption. They were key operatives in a criminal network that stretched from Mexico to Canada, from legitimate businesses to international cartels. Mayor Walsh coordinated political protection and law enforcement corruption. Thomas Mackenzie handled financial operations and money laundering. Doc Henley provided medical services for human trafficking victims and treated injuries that couldn't be reported to hospitals. Even Sheriff Jake Morrison from the county office wasn't just taking bribes. He was actively coordinating law enforcement protection for criminal activities, using his authority to suppress investigations and eliminate threats to the conspiracy. Sarah's final report, dated the day she disappeared, revealed her discovery that the conspiracy included federal agents within the FBI itself. Her request for extraction had been denied, not because the investigation required continued deep cover, but because someone in federal law enforcement was protecting the Silver Hollow operation and couldn't afford to have Agent Sarah Chen escape with evidence of their involvement. "She wasn't killed by local conspirators," Amos said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "She was eliminated by federal agents who were protecting the operation from within the Bureau." Rosa nodded grimly. "And if they killed a federal agent 20 years ago to protect this conspiracy, they won't hesitate to kill a small-town sheriff and his deputy to keep it buried now." The sound of movement in the tunnels behind them interrupted their analysis, footsteps and voices that were getting closer. Searchers who knew the underground passages and were systematically checking each branch and chamber. But these weren't the heavy boots of tactical teams or the coordination calls of legitimate law enforcement. These were the quiet movements of professionals who operated in shadows, who eliminated problems without fanfare or official acknowledgement. "We need to reach federal authorities who aren't compromised," Rosa said, gathering Sarah's evidence with efficient urgency. "But we can't trust FBI channels if the conspiracy reaches that high." Amos thought of the photographs showing Sheriff Morrison's involvement, the documents revealing political corruption at multiple levels, the scope of criminal activity that required protection from federal agents. Standard law enforcement channels were compromised, official investigation protocols would be blocked or misdirected, and any attempt to surrender evidence through normal channels would result in their deaths and the evidence's destruction. But as they prepared to flee deeper into the tunnel system, Amos remembered something from Sarah's letters that offered a different possibility. She'd mentioned Doc Henley, trying to warn her, suggesting he suspected something was wrong, even though he didn't know specifics. If Doc was involved in the conspiracy, but had developed conscience about it, he might be the key to reaching help that couldn't be corrupted or silenced. The gamble was enormous, approaching someone who appeared in Sarah's photographs as a co-conspirator, trusting that 20 years of guilt and community connection might outweigh criminal loyalty. But with federal agents hunting them in tunnels that favored their pursuers, and with innocent civilians being held hostage to ensure their silence, conventional options had run out. "We're going to Doc Henley's house," Amos decided. "If he's the weak link Sarah thought he might be, he's our only chance to get evidence to people who can act on it." Rosa's expression showed skepticism about trusting a documented criminal, but she also understood that survival sometimes required impossible choices. They gathered Sarah's evidence and prepared to navigate tunnel passages toward a confrontation that would either save Silver Hollow or ensure their deaths accomplished. Nothing, except adding 2 more bodies to a conspiracy that had already lasted 20 years too long. Behind them, the footsteps were getting closer, and ahead lay darkness that might contain salvation or deeper betrayal. But Agent Sarah Chen had died trying to bring justice to Silver Hollow, and Sheriff Amos Callahan wasn't going to let her sacrifice be meaningless, even if honoring it cost him everything he'd spent his life protecting. The final recording device had been hidden behind a loose stone in the tunnel wall. Its digital memory containing Sarah Chen's last testament, 43 minutes of evidence that would either save Silver Hollow or ensure its destruction. Amos and Rosa huddled in the darkness beneath Doc Henley's house, listening to a dead woman's voice explain how deep the corruption ran and how many people would die if her evidence never reached the right authorities. "This is Agent Sarah Chen, badge number 2847, recording final operational summary for case file, Silver Hollow, 77 Alpha." Sarah's voice was steady despite circumstances that must have been terrifying, professional, even as she documented her own impending murder. "If this recording is discovered, it means my extraction failed, and the conspiracy has likely eliminated me to protect their operation." The recording revealed details that the written reports hadn't captured conversations Sarah had overheard. Meetings she'd witnessed, evidence of criminal activities that stretched far beyond what Amos had imagined possible in his quiet community. But more than that, it revealed her growing certainty that federal agents were protecting the Silver Hollow operation, that her own superiors were compromised, that requesting backup through official channels would result in her death rather than rescue. FBI Assistant Director Marcus Webb has been coordinating protection for the Silver Hollow operation since at least 2001. Sarah's voice continued, naming names that made Rosa's face go pale in the dim light. "Counterintelligence suggests Webb has been receiving payments through offshore accounts in exchange for suppressing investigations and eliminating agents who get too close to the truth." Webb was a name both Amos and Rosa recognized from news reports about federal law enforcement successes, a decorated agent whose career had been built on high-profile arrests and terrorist interdictions. But according to Sarah's recording, Webb's success had come from protecting some criminal enterprises while publicly destroying others, creating the appearance of effective law enforcement, while actually managing which crimes received attention and which remained hidden. "Local operatives are expendable to Webb's network," Sarah explained, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd realized the full scope of betrayal. "Mayor Walsh, Thomas Mackenzie, Sheriff Morrison, they're all assets that can be sacrificed if the operation is threatened. But Webb can't afford to have federal evidence surface that connects him to international criminal activities." The recording detailed Sarah's final plan, a desperate gambit to get evidence to congressional oversight committees that operated outside FBI jurisdiction, to journalists who specialized in federal corruption, to anyone with the resources and authority to act on what she'd discovered. But it also revealed her growing certainty that she wouldn't survive to see justice done. "I've hidden evidence caches throughout Silver Hollow," she said, her voice beginning to show strain as footsteps could be heard in the background. "Physical documents, photographs, financial records, recordings like this one. If something happens to me, if I disappear or die under suspicious circumstances, someone needs to find these caches and ensure they reach federal prosecutors who aren't compromised by Webb's network." Rosa paused the recording, her expression grim as she processed the implications. She scattered evidence throughout the town, multiple locations, insurance against exactly what happened to her. But for 20 years, no one knew to look for it, because everyone believed she was just Sarah Mackenzie, a troubled young woman who disappeared from a small town, Amos said. No one suspected they should be searching for federal evidence or investigating FBI corruption. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps above them. Doc Henley, moving through his house with the measured pace of a man who'd lived with terrible secrets for decades. The plan they'd formulated during their flight through the tunnels required confronting a documented criminal, trusting that guilt and community loyalty might outweigh 20 years of complicity in federal crimes. But as Amos prepared to climb into Doc's basement through the concealed tunnel entrance, Rosa grabbed his arm with fingers that felt like steel cables. "Sheriff, what if we're wrong about him? What if he's more committed to the conspiracy than to the town? We'd be walking into a trap with evidence that could destroy everyone involved." The question hung between them, like a weight that threatened to crush whatever hope they'd maintained during their underground flight from federal agents who wanted them dead. Doc Henley appeared in Sarah's photographs as a willing participant in criminal activities, had provided medical services for human trafficking operations, had been part of a conspiracy that had murdered a federal agent and terrorized a community for 2 decades. But he'd also tried to warn Sarah, according to her letters. He'd shown signs of conscience, of growing discomfort with activities that had started as simple corruption and evolved into something far more deadly. And his wife Martha had been dropping hints for years about secrets that needed to be exposed, about gardens that required weeding regardless of the disruption it might cause. "We're out of options," Amos said finally. "Federal agents are hunting us in tunnels they know better than we do. Local law enforcement is compromised. If we try to reach outside authorities without help, we'll be dead before we can make contact. Doc is our only chance, and if we're wrong about him, we're dead anyway." Rosa nodded reluctantly, understanding that survival sometimes required impossible gambles. They climbed into Doc Henley's basement, moving carefully through a space that looked deceptively normal medical supplies. Old furniture, family memorabilia that spoke of a lifetime spent serving Silver Hollow's community. But hidden behind legitimate medical equipment, they found evidence of Doc's participation in the conspiracy surgical instruments that had been used for purposes that had nothing to do with healing, medical records for people who didn't officially exist, supplies that suggested treatment of injuries that couldn't be reported to hospitals or authorities. Doc Henley descended the basement stairs slowly, his 74-year-old frame moving with the careful deliberation of a man who'd been expecting this confrontation for 20 years. He wasn't surprised to see them, wasn't alarmed by their presence in his basement, wasn't reaching for weapons or communication devices that might summon help. Instead, he sank into an old chair with the expression of someone who'd been carrying a burden too heavy to bear alone. "You found her," he said quietly, his voice carrying decades of guilt and sorrow. "You found Sarah Chen, and now you know what we did to her." Amos stepped forward carefully, his hand near his service weapon, but not threatening immediate violence. "Doc, we know you tried to warn her. We know you've been carrying this guilt for 20 years. Help us bring justice for what happened. Help us protect this town from people who've been using it for criminal activities." Doc's weathered hands shook as he lifted them to cover his face, his shoulders sagging with the weight of confession that had been building for 2 decades. "I became a doctor to heal people, to save lives, to serve my community. But they made me into something else, made me complicit in things that violated everything I'd sworn to uphold." The story emerged in fragments, interrupted by tears and silences that spoke of trauma that had never healed. Doc had been approached gradually, carefully, by people who understood how to compromise good men through small steps that led to larger betrayals. A favor for a friend who needed medical attention without official records. treatment for injuries that raised questions better left unasked, medical supplies for activities that served the greater good, or so he'd been told. By the time I understood what I'd become involved in, they owned me completely, he said, his voice breaking with the admission. I'd treated too many patients who shouldn't have existed, provided too many services that couldn't be explained, kept too many secrets that would destroy my family and my practice if they became public. But Sarah Chen's death had been the breaking point that Doc had never been able to cross. He'd been told she was a criminal, a threat to community safety, someone whose elimination served justice. But he'd grown to respect her during her brief time in Silver Hollow, had seen her genuine care for people and commitment to truth that reminded him of his younger self. When they brought me her body and told me to dispose of it quietly, I couldn't do it, Doc said. I couldn't make a federal agent disappear as if she'd never existed, never mattered, never died trying to protect people. So I hid her, preserved her, kept evidence that someday someone might find and use to bring justice. Rosa leaned forward, her expression intense. Doc, we need your help to get Sarah's evidence to federal authorities who aren't compromised. We need someone they trust, someone with credibility, someone who can testify about what really happened here. Doc lifted his head, and in his eyes was something that might have been hope or determination or simple exhaustion with carrying secrets that had poisoned 20 years of his life. I've been waiting for this day since the moment they killed her. I've been preparing for it, gathering my own evidence, documenting everything I could remember or discover about their activities. He led them to a hidden safe behind his medical supplies, revealing documents and recordings that complemented Sarah's evidence with testimony from someone who'd been inside the conspiracy since its beginning. Financial records showing payments for medical services that violated federal law. Names and dates of criminal activities that Doc had witnessed or participated in. Most importantly, evidence of Assistant Director Webb's personal involvement in ordering Sarah's death. This is enough to bring down the entire network, Doc said, his voice growing stronger with the relief of finally speaking truth after decades of enforced silence. But getting it to people who can act on it won't be easy. Webb has resources throughout federal law enforcement, contacts in Congress, the ability to destroy careers and eliminate threats. Outside, the sound of vehicles approaching suggested their window of opportunity was closing. Federal agents and local conspirators were coordinating a manhunt that would end with their deaths and the evidence's destruction. But Doc Henley had spent 20 years preparing for this moment, developing connections and contingencies that might give them a chance to survive long enough for justice to prevail. There's someone I trust, he said, moving toward a secure communication system that looked far more sophisticated than anything a small-town doctor should possess. Someone who's been investigating Webb's network from within Congress, someone who has the authority and resources to protect witnesses and act on evidence like this. As Doc activated communication protocols that had been decades in the planning, Amos understood that Sarah Chen's death had created an underground network of people committed to bringing justice to Silver Hollow, people who'd been waiting 20 years for evidence that could destroy the conspiracy that had murdered a federal agent and terrorized a community. The final battle for Silver Hollow's soul was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether Sarah Chen's sacrifice had meaning or whether the corruption that killed her would continue spreading for another 20 years. The town bell of Silver Hollow hadn't rung for an emergency assembly in 30 years. Not since the flood of 1994 had threatened to wash away Main Street and required every able-bodied citizen to help build sandbag barriers. But now its bronze voice cut through the morning air with urgent authority, summoning people from their homes and businesses to gather in the town square for an announcement that would change everything they believed about their community. Amos stood on the courthouse steps, Sarah's evidence arranged on a table before him like exhibits in a trial that had been 20 years in the making. Rosa flanked him on one side, her hand resting near her service weapon as she scanned the growing crowd for threats they both knew were coming. Doc Henley stood on his other side, 20 years of guilt and fear, replaced by grim determination to finally tell the truth that had been eating at his conscience since Agent Sarah Chen's murder. The townspeople gathered slowly, confusion and concern evident in their faces as they tried to understand why their sheriff would call an emergency assembly on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Peterson clutched her purse with arthritic fingers, probably wondering if this had anything to do with her mysterious newspaper thief. Pete Kowalski swayed slightly as he found a place near the back, his bloodshot eyes suggesting he'd started his day's drinking early to cope with whatever crisis required public announcement. But scattered throughout the crowd were faces that told a different story, people whose expressions showed they understood exactly why Sheriff Callahan had called this gathering, who knew what evidence he'd uncovered, who were calculating whether they could escape before truth destroyed the carefully constructed lies that had protected their criminal enterprise for 2 decades. Thomas Mackenzie stood near the bank's entrance, his banker's composure cracking as he recognized documents spread across the table that should have remained buried with Sarah Chen's bones. Mayor Patricia Walsh emerged from the municipal building with practiced political calm, but her eyes held the cold calculation of someone preparing for damage control that might require permanent solutions. Sheriff Jake Morrison's county vehicles were positioned at strategic points around the square, their occupants wearing tactical gear that seemed excessive for a routine public announcement. But Amos knew these weren't legitimate law enforcement officers. They were Webb's assets. Professionals whose job was to ensure no evidence from this gathering ever reached federal prosecutors who might act on it. "Citizens of Silver Hollow," Amos began, his voice carrying clearly across the square without artificial amplification, the way it had during 30 years of community meetings and civic celebrations. "I've called this gathering to share information about criminal activities that have been operating in our town for more than 20 years. Activities that have cost lives and corrupted the institutions we've trusted to protect us." The crowd stirred uneasily, conversations breaking out as people tried to understand what their sheriff was telling them. But Amos continued, his voice growing stronger as he felt the weight of Sarah's evidence backing his words. 20 years ago, a young woman named Sarah Mackenzie disappeared from Silver Hollow under circumstances that were never properly investigated. What you don't know is that Sarah Mackenzie was actually FBI agent Sarah Chen, sent here to investigate corruption and criminal activities that federal authorities had detected in our community. The reaction was immediate and chaotic gasps of shock, angry denials, demands for proof from people who couldn't believe their peaceful town harbored such secrets. But Thomas Mackenzie's face had gone pale, and Mayor Walsh was already moving toward the municipal building, where communication equipment would allow her to contact Webb's network for emergency response. Agent Chen spent 6 months documenting evidence of drug trafficking, money laundering, weapons smuggling, and human trafficking operations that used Silver Hollow as a distribution center. Amos continued, lifting photographs that showed respected citizens participating in activities that violated federal law. She gathered proof of corruption involving local officials, law enforcement personnel, and federal agents who were protecting these criminal enterprises from investigation. The crowd's mood was shifting from confusion to anger as people began to understand the implications of what they were hearing. Their town had been used, their trust betrayed, their safety compromised by people they'd elected and respected for decades. But the anger was mixed with fear, as they also began to realize that knowledge of such activities might make them targets for elimination. Doc Henley stepped forward, his voice shaking but determined as he began his own confession. "I was one of the people involved in these criminal activities. I provided medical services for human trafficking victims, treated injuries that couldn't be reported to hospitals, participated in activities that violated everything I swore to uphold as a physician. The crowd's attention focused on Doc, with the intensity of people watching their world collapse in real time. This wasn't their sheriff making wild accusations. This was their trusted family doctor admitting to crimes that had been hidden beneath the surface of their daily lives for 20 years. But when they brought me Agent Chen's body and ordered me to dispose of it, I couldn't cross that line, Doc continued, tears streaming down his weathered face. I couldn't make a federal agent disappear as if she'd never existed, never mattered, never died, trying to protect all of you from criminals who were using your town for illegal activities. Mayor Walsh had reached the municipal building and was speaking urgently into a communication device, her political composure finally cracking as she coordinated response to a situation that threatened to destroy the entire conspiracy. Around the square, people in tactical gear were moving into position with the coordination of professionals preparing for violence rather than crowd control. But Amos had one more revelation that would change everything, evidence that would ensure the truth couldn't be contained by eliminating witnesses or destroying documentation. The evidence Agent Chen gathered before her murder has been transmitted to congressional oversight committees, federal prosecutors outside the FBI chain of command, and journalists who specialize in government corruption, he announced, his voice carrying across the square with the authority of someone who'd spent his life protecting the community now gathered before him. The criminal network that killed her and terrorized this town for 20 years is already being dismantled by federal agencies that aren't compromised by the corruption she died exposing. The statement was partly bluff. Doc's contacts had promised to act on the evidence, but needed time to coordinate response that wouldn't be blocked by Webb's network within the FBI. But it served its purpose, causing confusion among the conspirators who were trying to decide whether elimination was still possible or if damage control required different strategies. Thomas Mackenzie broke first, abandoning his position near the bank and running toward the tunnel entrance that would allow him to escape through the underground network that had facilitated 20 years of criminal activity. But Rosa was ready for such attempts, coordinating with loyal sheriff's deputies who'd been positioned to prevent escape through routes the conspiracy had used for decades. The carefully maintained facade of Silver Hollow as a peaceful rural community was crumbling in real time, revealing the criminal infrastructure that had operated beneath the surface of daily life for 2 decades. And at the center of the collapse stood Sheriff Amos Callahan, finally bringing justice for FBI agent Sarah Chen's murder while protecting the citizens who'd been unknowingly living above a network of tunnels used by international criminals. Amos's father's gun felt familiar in his hands as he took cover behind the courthouse steps, its weight and balance unchanged despite decades in storage since the old sheriff's death. The weapon had served 3 generations of Callahan lawmen, had kept the peace through range wars and cattle rustling, through prohibition and depression, through all the challenges that came with protecting a community from those who would exploit its trust and safety. Now it would serve one final time in the hands of a sheriff facing the ultimate betrayal of everything law enforcement represented. The tactical team advancing across the town square wore federal insignia but served criminal masters, their equipment purchased with money stolen from the community they were now terrorizing. Sheriff Morrison coordinated their movement with hand signals that demonstrated professional competence corrupted by decades of criminal loyalty, his authority as a law enforcement officer perverted into protection for those who profited from human suffering. But the citizens of Silver Hollow were no longer passive victims of conspiracy and corruption. Pete Kowalski had sobered up fast when bullets started flying, his Korean War training reasserting itself as he organized civilian evacuation routes away from the violence. Mrs. Peterson surprised everyone by producing a shotgun from her purse, a weapon she'd carried for 30 years, in case anyone threatened her newspaper-stealing raccoon or anything else she cared about. Rosa had taken position behind the bank's stone facade, using her military experience to coordinate defensive fire that kept the tactical team from advancing while protecting civilians who were caught in the crossfire. But they were outnumbered and outgunned by professionals whose rules of engagement allowed for civilian casualties if it meant eliminating witnesses to 20 years of federal crimes. "Surrender the evidence, Sheriff," Morrison called from behind an armored vehicle that had no legitimate purpose in a small-town law enforcement operation. "This doesn't have to end with more bloodshed than necessary." The offer was meaningless. Morrison's team had orders to eliminate everyone who'd seen Sarah's evidence, everyone who could testify about the conspiracy, everyone whose continued existence threatened Assistant Director Webb's network. But Amos used the conversation to buy time for Doc Henley to complete transmission of evidence to federal authorities who weren't compromised by the corruption. "Sarah Chen died trying to protect this community," Amos called back, his voice carrying across the square to reach citizens who were witnessing their trusted institutions reveal their true nature. "She gave her life for justice, and her sacrifice won't be meaningless." The final assault began with tear gas canisters that filled the square with choking smoke, a tactical decision that showed Morrison's team cared nothing for civilian safety. But the smoke worked both ways, concealing defensive positions while making it harder for the attackers to coordinate their advance. In the chaos of smoke and gunfire, Thomas Mackenzie made his final play for escape, emerging from the tunnel system with a suitcase full of cash and documents that could implicate him in federal crimes spanning 2 decades. But he found his escape route blocked by Martha Henley, Doc's 72-year-old wife, standing in the middle of Main Street with a garden hose and an expression of absolute moral outrage. "Thomas Mackenzie," she said with the voice she'd used to scold misbehaving children for 50 years of Sunday school teaching, "you put that suitcase down and march yourself back to face what you've done to this community." The absurdity of the confrontation, an elderly woman with a garden hose facing down a desperate criminal, might have been comedic under different circumstances. But Thomas was carrying a weapon, was willing to kill anyone who stood between him and escape, was beyond the reach of moral authority or community shame. He raised his pistol toward Martha with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd already crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. But Doc Henley's confession had included more than just testimony about his own participation in criminal activities. It had also revealed the locations of weapons, caches, and defensive positions that the conspiracy had prepared for. Exactly this kind of emergency. The shot that took down Thomas Mackenzie came from Mrs. Peterson's shotgun, fired by a 78-year-old woman who decided that protecting her community's newspaper delivery was less important than protecting its citizens from criminals who'd been exploiting them for decades. Thomas fell in the middle of Main Street, his suitcase spilling cash and documents across pavement where children had played hopscotch and elderly citizens had walked to church for generations. But Thomas's elimination didn't end the threat to Silver Hollow's citizens. Morrison's tactical team was advancing through the smoke with professional precision, closing distance toward positions where Amos, Rosa, and Doc had taken cover with evidence that could destroy Webb's entire network. The turning point came when Pete Kowalski emerged from Murphy's Tavern with a hunting rifle and steady hands that hadn't held a weapon in 40 years, but retained muscle memory from a war fought on the other side of the world. His first shot took down the point man advancing on Rosa's position. His second eliminated the communications specialist coordinating the assault. "Told you I was walking the straight and narrow," Pete called to Amos with grim humor that belied the deadly accuracy of his supporting fire. "Guess that includes shooting straight when it matters." The tactical team's advance faltered as they realized they were facing not just law enforcement officers, but an entire community that had decided to fight back against the criminals who'd been exploiting them. Citizens who'd been terrorized into silence for 20 years were finding their voices, finding their courage, finding weapons and determination to protect the place they called home. Sheriff Morrison tried to rally his team for a final assault on the courthouse steps, where Sarah's evidence was displayed like an indictment of 2 decades of corruption. But he was stopped by a voice that cut through the chaos with federal authority that couldn't be questioned or corrupted. "This is FBI Assistant Director Jennifer Walsh, no relation to your mayor with Counterintelligence Division. You are surrounded by federal agents acting on evidence provided by congressional oversight committees. Drop your weapons immediately and prepare for arrest on charges of conspiracy, murder, and treason." The real federal agents emerged from positions they'd held since dawn, having used Doc Henley's intelligence network to coordinate a response that would capture the entire local conspiracy while protecting the citizens who'd been unknowingly living above a criminal distribution center. Assistant Director Walsh, the Patricia Walsh they knew, had apparently borrowed the name from someone with legitimate authority, commanded resources that dwarfed Morrison's corrupt tactical team. Sheriff Jake Morrison looked around the square, taking in the federal agents who had him surrounded, the citizens who were pointing weapons at him, the evidence displayed on the courthouse steps that would destroy everyone he'd served for 20 years. His expression showed the recognition that comes to criminals when they realize their schemes have finally collapsed beyond any possibility of escape or damage control. But rather than surrender, Morrison made the choice that desperate men often make when facing consequences for a lifetime of wrong decisions. He raised his weapon toward the civilians he'd sworn to protect, choosing to go down fighting rather than face justice for crimes that had included murdering a federal agent. Amos's father's gun spoke with the authority of 3 generations of law enforcement, its bullet finding its target with precision that would have made the old sheriff proud. Morrison fell beside Thomas Mackenzie in the middle of Main Street, ending the careers of 2 men who'd chosen corruption over community service, profit over protection, and betrayal over the trust that citizens place in their elected officials. The battle for Silver Hollow was over, but the work of healing and rebuilding would take much longer than the few minutes of violence that had finally brought justice for Agent Sarah Chen's murder. The FBI Commendation Medal felt heavier than its metal composition should allow, its weight seeming to concentrate 20 years of guilt, love, betrayal, and finally justice into a piece of bronze and ribbon that represented Agent Sarah Chen's sacrifice for a community she'd grown to care about more than her own safety. Amos held the posthumous decoration carefully as he stood beside her properly marked grave in Silver Hollow Cemetery, where she could finally rest among the people she'd died trying to protect. 3 months had passed since the confrontation in the town square that had ended the criminal conspiracy and brought federal attention to corruption that reached from small-town banks to the highest levels of law enforcement. Assistant Director Marcus Webb was serving life in federal prison, his network of corrupt agents and local assets dismantled by congressional investigations that had used Sarah's evidence to expose decades of criminal activity disguised as legitimate government operations. Mayor Patricia Walsh, who turned out to be Patricia Wallace, a mid-level criminal using false credentials to coordinate political protection for the conspiracy, had cooperated with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony had led to arrests throughout the Southwest, dismantling human trafficking operations that had used Silver Hollow's tunnel network to transport victims across state lines. Thomas Mackenzie's bank had been seized by federal regulators, its assets frozen, while investigators worked to separate legitimate community funds from money laundered through international criminal enterprises. The citizens of Silver Hollow were gradually recovering their savings, though the process would take years, and the trust would take even longer to rebuild. Doc Henley had received immunity in exchange for his testimony and cooperation, but he'd surrendered his medical license voluntarily, unable to continue practicing medicine after violating his oath so thoroughly. He spent his days now tending Martha's garden, finding peace in nurturing life after decades of being complicit in activities that had destroyed it. His testimony had been crucial in ensuring that other medical professionals involved in human trafficking operations received appropriate punishment. But it was the human cost that weighed most heavily on Amos as he placed fresh flowers on Sarah's grave. Families torn apart by the revelation that respected citizens were criminals. Children struggling to understand how their teachers and neighbors could have participated in such terrible activities. Elderly residents confronting the possibility that their entire adult lives had been spent in a community built on foundations of corruption and violence. Rosa had been promoted to sheriff with unanimous support from the county commissioners, her integrity and courage during the crisis, earning respect from citizens who needed law enforcement they could trust without reservation. She'd kept Amos on as deputy, though they both understood his heart wasn't in routine police work anymore. The weight of Sarah's memory, the complexity of his feelings about their relationship, the exhaustion that came from learning how deeply corruption had penetrated everything he'd trusted, all of it made simple law enforcement seem inadequate to the challenges facing Silver Hollow's future. "She would have been proud of what you did," Rosa said, joining him beside the grave marker that bore Sarah's real name and FBI badge number. Agent Chen died, believing the evidence might never surface, that her sacrifice might be meaningless. But you made sure her work mattered. Amos nodded, though pride felt like the wrong emotion for survival that had cost so many lives and revealed so many painful truths. "I just wish I'd understood who she really was while she was alive. Wish I'd been someone she could trust with the truth, instead of someone she had to investigate. She did trust you, eventually. The letters make that clear. She fell in love with you despite her professional training. Requested transfer to protect both you and the mission. That's not something agents do for targets, they're just manipulating." The consolation helped, but couldn't entirely heal wounds that went deeper than professional betrayal. Every memory of their relationship now carried the complexity of knowing it had begun as federal surveillance, that her initial interest had been assignment rather than attraction, that she'd been trained to read his emotions and exploit them for intelligence purposes. The love that had developed was real, but it had grown from foundations of deception that complicated every tender moment they'd shared. Pete Kowalski approached from the cemetery entrance, moving with the steady gait of a man who'd found purpose in his final years. Sobriety had come naturally after the confrontation that had tested his old military training, and he'd become an unofficial guardian of Silver Hollow's healing process. His war experience helped him understand how communities recovered from trauma, how people found meaning after discovering their trust had been betrayed. "Afternoon, Sheriff Deputy," he said with the courtesy that had always marked his interactions, despite decades of alcoholic haze. "Thought you'd like to know the state investigators finished their report on the tunnel system. Going to seal most of the entrances, turn the main chambers into a museum about Prohibition history and the importance of community vigilance against corruption." The decision made sense. The tunnels were part of Silver Hollow's history, for better and worse, and pretending they'd never existed wouldn't serve anyone's interests. Better to acknowledge the past honestly, learn from it, use it to educate future generations about how easily trust could be exploited by those who sought to profit from community vulnerability. "How are people adjusting?" Rosa asked, a question that had occupied much of her attention since taking over as sheriff. The psychological impact of learning their community had been built on criminal foundations was still affecting everyone, from children afraid their neighbors might be secret criminals to elderly residents questioning every relationship they'd built over decades of small-town life. "Better than you might expect," Pete said thoughtfully. "Turns out people are more resilient than they give themselves credit for." Mrs. Peterson organized a support group for folks struggling with trust issues, calls it the Neighborhood Watch Recovery Circle. Martha Henley started teaching classes about recognizing signs of community corruption. Even the teenagers are getting involved, creating social media campaigns about the importance of civic engagement. The resilience was encouraging, evidence that Silver Hollow's fundamental character hadn't been destroyed by the revelation of criminal activity in its leadership. But it was also sobering, a reminder that communities needed constant vigilance to prevent corruption from taking root, that trust was fragile and required active maintenance by citizens who cared more about truth than comfort. Dustfire nickered softly from the cemetery fence, where he waited with the patience that had made him such an effective partner in uncovering Sarah's grave. The Stallion had returned to normal behavior after the conspiracy's exposure, no longer circling the patch of earth where secrets had been buried. But sometimes Amos caught him looking toward the cemetery with what seemed like understanding that his work had mattered, that his instincts had led to justice for someone who'd needed an advocate. As the afternoon light cast long shadows across the cemetery, Amos made his final decision about his future in Silver Hollow. The town needed healing more than it needed his law enforcement experience, needed leaders who could help it build new foundations based on transparency and community engagement, rather than the quiet authority that had allowed corruption to flourish, undetected. "I'm retiring at the end of the year," he told Rosa, the words feeling both inevitable and liberating. 31 years is enough, and the town needs fresh leadership from people who weren't part of the old system. Rosa nodded, unsurprised by the decision. "What will you do?" Amos looked toward the cemetery entrance where Martha Henley was tending flowers that would bloom through spring and summer, nurturing beauty that would outlast the people who planted it. "I think I'll learn about gardens, about how to plant things that grow strong roots, how to recognize what's healthy and what needs to be removed before it spreads, how to tend something that serves the community long after the gardener is gone." The metaphor was apt. Silver Hollow needed people who understood that healthy communities required constant attention, that corruption was like weeds that would spread if ignored. That trust was something that grew slowly and required careful cultivation by people who understood its value. As they walked toward the cemetery entrance, Amos carried with him the weight of Sarah's memory and the knowledge that her sacrifice had meaning beyond the criminals it had exposed. She died believing that truth mattered more than safety, that justice was worth any personal cost, that communities deserved protection from those who would exploit their trust for personal gain. Agent Sarah Chen's final gift to Silver Hollow wasn't just the evidence that had destroyed a criminal conspiracy. It was the reminder that democracy required active participation by citizens who cared more about their community's welfare than their own comfort. In a world where corruption often succeeded because good people remained silent, she'd chosen to speak truth, even when it cost her life. And Sheriff Amos Callahan had ensured that her voice was finally heard, 20 years after criminals had tried to silence it forever.